Hi everyone, my name is Elizabeth and I'm a part of the debate hotline, and this is a public forum topic lecture for Septober of 2025. The resolution is resolved the United Kingdom should rejoin the European Union. So here's a couple parts of background information. First of all, what is the EU? So the EU was originally the European Economic Community, and they have a couple major institutions: the European Council, the European Parliament, and the European Commission, and a lot of other things. We recommend that you look into some of these major institutions. They're pretty important. But not only that, all of the countries that are a part of the EU have to abide by a single market, and that means that there's a free movement of goods, services, capital, and people. And there's been arguments on both sides that the single market is good and the single market is also bad, and there's reasons for both sides as well. The single market just means that every country has to adhere to a similar policy when creating their products and trading their products. So it becomes easier, there's less tariffs, and there's less barriers to trade. However, there's also arguments that the single barrier is bad because no country wants to abide by a singular set of regulations that creates fragmentation, and countries can disagree about what they believe is good for a single market, which hurts a lot of countries and their economies. Next, the EU also has policy coordination. So, for things like trade, agriculture, the environment, and regional development, they come together and create policies to try and fix those things. Trade goes along with the single market argument. They try to do things for the environment, they try to help agriculture, but they also help a lot of regional development. Not only that, but there's regulatory harmony. So, a common argument is that some countries in the EU wouldn't like the UK rejoining. For example, Cyprus, Ireland, Greece, Spain, those countries have some gripes with the UK in that regard. So, in order to be in the EU, there has to be some sort of harmony between all the countries. And a way that that manifests is in veto power. So, for policy to be implemented and to be approved, it has to have a unanimous vote on areas like defense and budget and other things, which can make it a little bit tricky to actually have policy be passed and be effective, which can also be an argument as to why the UK joining could either make it harder, or the UK joining could increase cohesion and actually fix unanimity. Yeah. So let's talk about the UK specifically. The UK consists of the countries of England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and some miscellaneous islands. So they have a constitutional monarchy, so they have a king and a queen, but they also have a parliamentary democracy. They also have a prime minister in the House of Commons. A really specific prime minister that you'll see a lot is Starmer, and he actually has really strong opinions over whether the UK should rejoin the EU or not. And a lot of the evidence can be used in rounds to explain whether whether the actor has incentive to actually join back to the EU, whether it'll be successful or not based on what they're saying. So that's something good to look into. But the UK is part of the Powerful Five. It's part of the Great Seven or Great 20, and it is a founding member for NATO. Yeah. So in this topic, you're going to hear about Brexit a lot. What is Brexit? Well, Brexit was the Prime Minister David Cameron's failed gambit. In 2016, there was a referendum. 52% wanted to leave the EU and 48% didn't want to. That number has changed since then. In 2025, it's a lot different. People right now, there's a slight majority that want to rejoin the EU and that think that Brexit has been bad. But those numbers, we recommend you to go look at them yourselves. There's been a slight majority, but there's still a lot of contention about the topic itself. So the drivers for why, Brexit essentially is just the UK leaving the EU, and it's an official agreement that states why the UK has left the EU and things like that. So the reason why Brexit was caused in the first place is because of immigration concerns, sovereignty or freedom concerns, and also economic grievances. And one of those big economic grievances is that the UK really didn't want to be a part of the euro and didn't like being a part of the singular market. In January 2020, this is under Article 50. This is when the UK officially left the EU and when Brexit was officially, signed. And in January 2021, there's been new trade barriers between the UK and EU, and they negotiated a trading cooperation agreement. Also, since then, there's been a lot more different trade agreements that the UK has been in, and we recommend you to go further research into those because those can be really good aspects for arguments and they can be pretty important. So, what does the current relationship between the UK and the EU look like? Well, cooperation has actually expanded due to the Prime Minister Starmer. He wants to seek a reset of relations between the UK and EU. Don't mistake this with rejoining the EU. Right now, they actually have a second agreement or a separate agreement that is sort of similar. It's like a summit, and we recommend that you explore that as well. There are nuances to that. It does include mostly just defense and specific arguments, so it doesn't include every single aspect of the UK or of the EU and what they entail of, but there are benefits that come from this summit, and we do implore you to research that. So the red line is currently joining the single market and customs unit. There's small scale but expanding in defense policy, trade, fishing, etc. Northern Ireland still follows a lot of EU policy, and the UK has negotiated independent trade deals. For example, the CPT, PP. There's also been an India UK trade deal, and there's been a lot more. So feel free to research those. So, what does the public opinion on rejoining the EU look like? Well, there's actually been shifting attitude since 2020 when it was first signed. Like we've said, in 2024, the YouGov poll says that 57% of people in the UK would favor rejoining now, but this is under a special condition. This is only with a special previous relationship where the EU powers want the UK back without opt outs. So this just means that the UK isn't able to opt out of things like taking advantage of the euro, of having to abide by regulations that other countries in the EU have to abide by. And that's pretty important because the UK didn't really like a lot of those things, and that can be a point of political turmoil and make it difficult for the UK to want to rejoin. So what does the rejoin process look like? Well, the rejoin process requires unanimous EU approval, and the topic is and in public forum, the topic is the most probable implementation. And for that, it would probably be that the EU would force Britain to join back without opt-out. So for example, like I said before, you'd have to adopt the euro, followed by every single other thing that EU countries have to abide by and a lot of regulations. However, there is an argument that when the UK does join back, they now have a seat at the table and are able to negotiate on certain policies and create change that they would enjoy alongside other countries. Let's talk about some argument sides now. On the pro, the first argument that you'll see a lot, it's very, very common, is economics. So there's a couple different versions of this. They pretty much all have the same uniqueness. So there's been immediate inflation after the referendum. The pound has weakened. There's been a decrease in imports and exports because of Brexit. Brexit overall has caused a loss of GDP. The numbers agree. A lot of economists also agree, but there's also a lot of evidence against this. There's evidence that GDP has increased in the past 5 years, that Brexit just takes a long time to get used to, but it is slow, but it will eventually help, and that actually trade has increased. So we really recommend you to do proper research on this and compare evidence thoroughly and use trustworthy sources. But the pro argument consists of a negative status quo or uniqueness. So right now, the economy is doing bad. And this is because of Brexit. Brexit creates trade barriers. There's more tariffs. It's harder to trade. There's labor shortages. There's foreign direct investment reductions, and that small and medium-sized enterprises or businesses are struggling because they can't keep up with this changing market. And these new regulations have become really difficult for them to continue to be a part of. The argument is that once they rejoin the UK or once they rejoin the EU, rejoining that singular market is really, really good for a lot of these businesses and to reduce trade barriers and labor shortages, which solves back for that economic problem, solves for some form of poverty, and is essentially just really good overall. The second type of argument you'll hear is British influence in the EU. So this means that the UK will have a seat at the table, right? The EU is already powerful, but the EU could be even more powerful with the UK. It's essentially a win-win agreement. It increases the amount of diplomatic capital that each country has, and it also creates a sense of which country is a rule maker and which country is a rule taker. Like I said before, once the UK rejoins, there's a little bit of wiggle room for regulations and negotiations. So the UK can potentially, negotiate for laws and policies that would benefit themselves and other countries, and just be a net positive experience for everyone. Now let's talk about social advantages. There's a couple different social advantages that come from being in the UK. For example, student exchange programs like Erasmus Plus. A lot of British people live in the EU and a lot of EU citizens living in the UK, which makes it really easy for immigration if the UK were to rejoin. Otherwise, there is problems with immigration right now. Some people say that there's too many people living in Britain, there's not enough housing, but also if there's more immigration, this allows for more cultural exchange, a larger European community, and it allows for easier right protections and labor protections as well, as there's just more collaboration and there's more innovation going on when people move around and they're allowed to spread their ideas. Similar to the last argument, there's another form of social security that is very helpful from the UK. So the current threats happening in the status quo are Russian gray zone aggressions, terrorism, transnational crime, human trafficking, cyber attacks, etc. There's just a lot of stuff going on, and the EU has a large role in collective defense. For example, SAFE program, PESCO, Europol, which essentially just target trafficking programs and arrest people that are really bad in circles and rings, which means that the only way to solve this would just to be to rejoin. Europol gets a lot stronger if they have information from the UK, and it becomes a lot easier for them. It's a net benefit for almost everyone in the scenario. They're also able to coordinate sanctions, and they're also able to share intelligence, which makes arresting people and arresting cartels and a lot of terrorism and crime just a lot easier. Another argument is that when the UK rejoins, there allows to be a lot more intelligence sharing for both research and development. For example, the Horizon Europe Scientific Research Program has limited access right now, but once you affirm the access increases, they have more research, they have more development, which helps scientific research, could solve for a multitude of problems. But not only that, the EU would allow grants, which makes it easier for the UK to research. There's less money issues, there's less financial problems. But not only that, there's also a mutual recognition of professional qualifications, and a really big argument is stopping healthcare crises or medical crises. For example, there's evidence saying that a pandemic could be imminent and could be likely, so a quick EU and UK response would be very important. Otherwise, a pandemic would be detrimental. So in order to solve for that, you have to have the proper equipment, you have to have stockpiles, you have to have a proper response. And right now, countries can't support that. They just don't have enough finances. They don't have enough intelligence. So the only way to solve that would be to share all of this and to get more money from rejoining the UK. Now let's talk about a couple of con arguments. So a really big con argument is political turmoil. This means that UK voters and both EU demands would cause tensions. So in both cases, let's talk about the first case of UK voters. Because there's tensions on whether Starmer would want to rejoin or not, and whether the voters actually want to rejoin the UK, there's a lot of polarization between the two factions and between the two ideas. And if we do something as rash as just rejoining the EU immediately, then that leads to a lot of aggression within these political tensions, which could potentially lead to turmoil, making it really difficult for the UK to function properly if they're going through, political problems in their own countries. Not only that, but another example of turmoil would be within the EU itself. So, for example, in the EU countries, like I mentioned before, Cyprus, Germany, or Greece, Spain, and Ireland don't really want to rejoin the EU. So there could be turmoil within the EU itself and countries accepting the UK back in. There's evidence that says that they do, but there's also evidence saying that they don't. So make sure to do the proper analysis on that during your debate round and to really analyze each actor and what their incentives are with the affirmative. Oh yeah, this is the argument I just explained, whether the UK membership is actually good for the EU. Like I said before, there's a lot of differences in opinions. There's almost 27 or over 27 countries in the organization, and it can be very politically challenging to get everyone on the same page, and it could potentially ruin the EU, make it really difficult for them to do any policies with the UK in it. Also, the idea that the UK hasn't committed before and that possibly they won't be really willing to commit in the future could create suspicion within the EU and potentially break that down as well. Another argument is inequality. So this is kind of similar or a response to the economics argument, but GDP isn't just the full picture. A lot of the economic benefits could just go to only the top percent of wealthy people. There's offshoring and onshoring, but also brain drain. So when you have that open border and migration is easier, a lot of people with high degrees and high education that would often make a lot of money and economic growth for their country would leave and just benefit the wealthier countries. So a lot of developing countries and smaller countries don't get the economic benefits that they should. Another argument is sovereignty and autonomy. So a lot of heavyweights in the EU, like Germany and France, are arguing for policies and regulations. And this could be potentially difficult if the UK were to join. It would just create a lot of turmoil within. People don't know which policies is their own. They want control over their own, and it just becomes very difficult overall. Not only that, but to rejoin the EU, the UK would be forced to adopt the euro under the premise of the most plausible implementation, which undermines UK fiscal resilience. If the if this strengthens the euro, it replaces the dollar, which leads to a dollar hedge impact that's terrible for a lot of countries. So these are all of the arts that are pretty much stock, and you'll be seeing a lot around in the circuit during this month and October. So I hope this sort of cleared up and explained some of these arguments. Hopefully you understand these and you'll be able to research these on your own. Remember that these are just baseline arguments for you to think about and then possibly experiment with. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to the debate hotline on any of our social media or on our website. And yeah, thank you so much for watching this video. We truly appreciate it.